Watch out, Jamie. You know he's around. Oh, there he is. I told you. I told you he's right around the corner.
Behind you. Oh, turn. Behind you. Behind you.
Violence is good. Not the violence itself, obviously, but the watching of it. Every year, violent films, true crime documentaries, and war footage dominate the box office, Netflix, and the news. So why do we voluntarily surround ourselves with so much violence? And is it doing us any good? Or are we actually amplifying the violent desires instead of satisfying them? Watching violence wasn't invented when film was. Every time a jump scare makes your heart race or war footage keeps you glued to the screen, you're satisfying millions of years of human evolution. Because those who didn't prioritize threat detection didn't survive. We have a fight or flight response hardwired into our nervous systems that allows us to not only be prepared for violence, but to anticipate it. This trait was favored in the wild because violence is information about the social world, and you don't have to experience it directly to learn from it. One reason we may have developed empathy is because observing violence and learning from it taught us who not to engage with and what rules not to break. So because of this, the body's natural threat response can feel exciting rather than distressing when we know we are safe. Watching films allows us to experience many of the physical effects of fear, such as an increased heart rate, the release of adrenaline, and heightened alertness, without facing any real danger. In a study by Timothy Wilson, later recreated by Vsauce, he gave a painful electric shock to a volunteer. After receiving the shock, he stated that he wished to never experience it again.
Why wouldn't you?
Because it shocked me and I can still feel it going down my forearm.
However, after being left in a room with nothing to do except choose to be shocked again, he decided that he'd rather be in pain than be bored, and it didn't take him long to shock himself again. This study illustrates that our brains are so starved of stimulation that they choose suffering over emptiness. And as I said before, threat is the ultimate stimulant. But it's not always delivered in the same way. Roman colosseums created scheduled events around violence and death. Greek tragedies formalised fate and suffering into theatre, and public executions made a social occasion in the town square out of death. So every era has found its own container for the same impulse. Even today in boxing, consensual violence is sold as a pay-per-view sport. Violence has always been a communal spectacle, and film has just become the most efficient way to distribute it to millions of people at once. The 24-hour news cycle has created a spectacle of an endless stream of real suffering delivered across the globe. We convince ourselves that we need to stay informed, but the news is just satisfying the same ancient impulses. So there is a big difference between wanting to be informed and being compelled to watch. The 1986 Russian war film Come and See uses its title to invite the audience in to witness the horrors of war. We watch this child suffer through the brutal torture of war and age visibly because of it. And this film successfully worked as entertainment and as trauma simultaneously. It encourages you to watch but not to enjoy by making the violence feel as real as possible. This film's use of violence makes you never want to see it again. But not every film uses it in this way. For example, Quentin Tarantino's work has the opposite effect. He wants violence to feel earned and pleasurable. Inglourious Basterds uses stylized violence that aims to be satisfying. The scalping of Nazis and the rewriting of history by having Hitler killed is cathartic. In an evolutionary sense, he's the ultimate outgroup enemy. Hitler represents a moral injustice, and Inglourious Basterds allows us to feel relief from the grief that has no real-world solution. But it also kind of uses a revenge fantasy as a bit of a moral permission slip. So where do we draw the line between justice and vengeance? To answer this, we'll need to look at the Stanford Prison Experiment.
These are not prisoners, and this is not a prison.
In 1971, a psychological experiment was conducted at Stanford University, where participants were given roles of guards and prisoners. The experiment was abruptly stopped when it became obvious that those with the role of guards had taken their abuse way too far.
We had an experiment because they had created a prison in which people were suffering. Some of the guards were behaving sadistically, brutally, and many of the guards who were not were helpless to do anything about it, indeed allowed it to go on.
Although often criticised, the Stanford Prison Experiment demonstrates that when people believe they have moral justification, they can commit acts of extraordinary cruelty. Participants assigned to be guards quickly adopted abusive behaviours, believing they were doing it for the right reasons. And Inglourious Basterds is asking how much cruelty can be justified if you believed it served a just cause. Tarantino is inviting us to enjoy the revenge against the Nazis, so we are crossing the same line as the guards in the experiment by having us believe that this violence is okay because it's justified. True crime is a little bit different though. It's unique because it contains a layer of voyeurism that isn't found in traditional fictional media. Most true crime treats killers as fascinating characters, promoting them as nothing deeper than horror icons and Halloween costumes. However, in 2008, filmmaker Kurt Quinn released a harrowing documentary called Dear Zachary. The film follows grandparents David and Kathleen, who have to be civil with their son's ex-girlfriend and killer in order to see their only grandchild. And midway through the film, something happens that reframes everything you've just watched, and the grief stops being something you just observe, but something you feel. Dear Zachary depicts a real family experiencing real grief and focuses on the victims instead of keeping them at arm's length, so you're denied the comfortable distance. Instead, you're forced to sit and suffer this human cost yourself.
My movie might be one of the only ways Zachary could see and get to know his father.
Our response to violence completely shifts when grief is the focus rather than spectacle. The evolutionary purpose of watching violence is to learn from it safely, but Dear Zachary removes the feeling of safety. And this is where horror films differ. Fictional horror depends on these levels of safety so that audiences can enjoy these situations without real fear. Scream is a self-aware slasher film that knows how to poke fun at the absurdity of the genre and the expectations of the audience. Because horror films follow such a distinct, repeatable structure, cycling between tension and resolution, Scream can make fun of the audience's love for these tropes. When I was about 9 years old, I watched a pretty violent and scary scene from a Chucky film with a group of friends at a sleepover. It was terrifying to me as a child, and at the time I felt like I was scarred for life. Yet watching this scene now doesn't evoke any of those same reactions. So if our relationship with violence is encoded in our DNA, why did my child self have such a different reaction? The answer is that the evolutionary drive and our ability to regulate it aren't the same thing and develop at different speeds. The most important aspect is the threat response, so this is what we develop first. My 9-year-old self could easily identify the scene as scary and the gore as a threat, probably also because I was short and ginger. So children have the threat detection, but lack the regularity capacity and prior exposure to contextualize it as non-dangerous, so they're much less prepared for the fear when it does arrive, and they haven't yet developed the mechanism to defend against this. So now that I'm past childhood, I'm much more familiar with this fear and resolution loop. So as a child, experiencing my first piece of horror that wasn't Wallace and Gromit Curse of the Were-Rabbit, I had no idea how easily this feeling would pass once you get used to it. I wasn't scarred, but I thought I was, just because of a lack of experience. Age ratings, such as the British Board of Film Classification here in the UK, aren't protecting against the contents of the film, because the threat is the same to all ages. 0. But rather the mismatch between the intensity of the experience and the child's ability to process it. The evolutionary draw to violent stimuli is already there in children. What isn't there is the tolerance built from years of exposure. The film Funny Games, released in 2007, took this idea of audience expectations in horror one step further. Director Michael Haneke wanted to criticize American audiences and their relationship with violent media. The film depicts a home invasion that makes you feel guilty for wanting to watch it and then denies you all of your expectations. There are no competent victims fighting back, there's no justice. We just have to sit and watch them suffer and think about the fact that this is secretly what we wanted.
Why don't you just kill us?
You shouldn't forget the importance of entertainment.
Skip to this part of the video if you don't want to have it spoiled. Towards the end of the film, there's a scene where the family actually gets ahead of the criminals and one of them is killed. However, the other killer immediately just rewinds the scene to stop it happening. He effectively, momentarily, steps out of the logic of the film to forcefully deny the audience an escape from the torture. In most thrillers, violence is organised towards the building and releasing of tension, but here, the violence is purely domination and the audience is denied any escape or escalation, even if that requires breaking the rules of narrative storytelling. But some violent films are made with the intention to purely entertain and give their audiences exactly what they came for, such as Saw. As the franchise progressed, it stripped away everything except its suffering. There is no attempt at memorable victims or moral questions, just physical destruction. We have an interest in the limits of the human body. Understanding bodily vulnerability has survival value. Morbid curiosity is, at the end of the day, just another form of curiosity. On the contrary, some violent films are made with the intention not to entertain. Salò, released in 1975, is a political statement about fascism and power. The film has no resolution and no hero, so the audience is left feeling complicit rather than satisfied. Salò is frequently dismissed as just gratuitous, which is exactly the reaction that director Pasolini expected, because being unable to look away from something that disgusts you is exactly his point. It has also been legally prohibited in a number of countries, which just reinforces his point. If societies themselves tried to ban the film, Pasolini was clearly making people confront something that they'd rather not face, and its themes even tie back to the Stanford prison experiment. Salò explores how hierarchy and ideology strip away empathy and lead to situations like the one in the experiment. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange explored how violence is naturally embedded into every human. The story follows a young delinquent called Alex, who, after being arrested for murder, is stripped of his violent impulses via the Ludovico technique. It asks whether we continue to be human without these violent impulses, or if what left is even worse. Kubrick is arguing that a society willing to produce this outcome hasn't solved violence, but just redistributed it. The state that tortures Alex into compliance is committing a violence just as cold and total. Kubrick doesn't want us to sympathise with the murderer, but notice that institutional violence is still violence, even if it seems more justifiable. So what have we learned? Does violence satisfy our natural impulse, or just amplify it? Unfortunately, there is no clear answer, but two very different ways to look at it. On one hand, Aristotle argued that watching violence and tragedy in a fictional space allowed for a catharsis. Our natural tensions are expressed and flushed away. Audiences may feel calmer after being satisfied with the experience of a violent film. However, the opposing view is that violent media desensitizes us and causes our violence threshold to rise. This means that we constantly need more extreme content to get the same response. Although desensitization to on-screen violence has been measured, there has never been any properly proven effect of this on real-world aggression. Scream makes a huge point about this.
He's sick for fuck's sake. You've seen one too many movies.
Nah, Sid! Don't you blame the movies! Movies don't create psychos! Movies make psychos more creative!
Your appetite for stimulation may grow without your behaviour changing at all. Decades of research have failed to find a causal link between violent games and violent behaviour, despite immense political pressure to find one. Japan's high rates of violent media have never impacted the famously low rates of crime, and there isn't even a proven link between true crime consumption and real crime. So really, all true crime is doing is making people more anxious and hypervigilant. There may be a correlation between people with real-world aggression seeking out violent media, but never the other way around. While horror films and social media may cause anxiety, desensitization, and distorted worldviews, there is no proven link between this and real-world violence. So if violent media isn't making us more violent, is the desensitization doing us any good? A reduced emotional response to violent stimuli after repeated exposure can be good. Without it, I could have never gotten over my 9-year-old fear of Chucky. However, does this numbness in turn create passivity? Here I think there's a clear distinction. Becoming unfazed to horror film gore is probably fine. However, I feel if we become unfazed by real suffering, such as war footage and true crime, it can create passivity that stops us responding to it practically. I touched on this idea in my Bo Burnham video that we now just scroll past war footage in the news. True crime fans obsess over killers while forgetting about the victims and their families. So I think we can become unfazed to something with no real world consequences, but we must never stop being moved by real world suffering. Our relationship with violent media is simultaneously a defense and a moral cost, so we just have to make sure that we're paying it deliberately and not by default.